The unwanted marriage. Captain Jonathan Carter stood tall in the grand hall of the Selverian Imperial Palace, his face blank, his heart pounding. The room shimmered with gold and violet lights, reflecting off towering crystalline pillars. Hundreds of alien nobles in elaborate robes watched him with unreadable expressions. They spoke in hushed tones, their whispers crawling through the air like insects. Carter was a soldier, a diplomat, a survivor, but he had never been a husband. And yet, here he was, standing beside Princess Serafina of Selveria, about to marry her. The ceremony had been arranged by Earth's leaders and the Selverian Emperor to secure a peace treaty. The Selverians, a powerful alien race, had clashed with humans before, but war was not in either side's best interest. A marriage was the solution, a symbol of unity, a gesture of peace. For Carter, it was just a formality, a meaningless ritual. Once the wedding was done, he would shake Serafina's hand, smile for the cameras, and return to his ship. But when he turned his head slightly to glance at his new bride, his stomach twisted. Serafina was staring at him. Not just looking, staring, watching, studying. Her golden eyes burned with something intense, something he couldn't understand. She was breathtakingly beautiful, with smooth silver-blue skin, long white hair woven with glowing jewels, and regal features that made her seem almost otherworldly. But it wasn't her beauty that unsettled him. It was the way she refused to look away. The high priest of Selveria, a towering figure wrapped in deep blue robes, raised his hands. The hall fell silent. By the sacred laws of the Selverian Empire, the priest declared, his voice deep and commanding, "This bond is now eternal. May your souls be forever entwined." Carter inhaled sharply as Serafina's cool fingers wrapped around his wrist. "Do you accept?" the priest asked. Carter forced himself to nod. "I do." Serafina's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I do," she said, her voice smooth as silk, but carrying an edge of something darker, deeper. A soft chime rang through the hall. The ceremony was over. The nobles clapped politely, but their faces showed no real emotion. To them, Carter was just a human, a foreigner, an outsider. He turned to Serafina, offering a stiff bow. "It was an honor, Your Highness. I will be leaving first thing in the morning." She tilted her head slightly. "Leaving?" Carter frowned. "Yeah, that was the deal. This is just political, right?" For a moment, Serafina said nothing. Then her golden eyes darkened, and her grip on his wrist tightened slightly. "You misunderstand," she murmured, her voice almost amused. "This is not just a ceremony, Jonathan Carter. This is a binding." A strange energy crackled in the air between them. Carter felt a sudden warmth in his chest, like invisible threads wrapping around him. Something was wrong. He glanced at the Selverian Emperor, a tall, imposing figure seated on his massive throne. The Emperor smirked but said nothing. "Wait," Carter said slowly. "What do you mean by binding?" Serafina took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "In human marriages, you can walk away," she said softly. "For Selverians, once a bond is sealed, it cannot be broken. There is no separation, no divorce, no escape." Carter's blood ran cold. The whispers of the nobles turned into muffled chuckles. Some of them smiled, their expressions filled with mocking amusement. They knew. They all knew. "I've been played." Carter's mind raced. He had agreed to this under the impression that it was a symbolic union, a political stunt. He hadn't signed up for this. "You're joking, right?" he said, trying to force a laugh. "This is all part of the show." Serafina's smile widened, just slightly. "I do not joke about matters of the soul," she whispered. Carter's heart pounded. He took a small step back, but Serafina didn't let go of his wrist. Her grip was gentle but firm. The Emperor finally spoke, his voice deep and amused. "You are bound, Captain Carter," he said. "You may try to leave, but you will find it difficult. Difficult." What the hell did that mean? Carter clenched his jaw. He needed to think, to plan, to figure out how to undo this mistake. But before he could say another word, Serafina gently pulled him forward. "It is time for the celebration," she said smoothly. "Come, my husband." The nobles laughed softly as they watched Carter's expression shift from confusion to silent rage. He had walked into a trap, and there was no way out. A bond that cannot be broken. Carter sat in stunned silence. The grand banquet hall was alive with laughter, music, and alien conversation, but all of it felt like background noise to him. The truth was sinking in, slow and heavy. He was trapped. Across from him, Princess Serafina sat gracefully, sipping from a delicate crystal goblet filled with luminous blue liquid. She looked calm, composed, as if she hadn't just shattered his entire understanding of this marriage. Carter's fingers curled around the edge of the table. "Think, Carter. Think." There had to be a loophole, a way out. A Selverian noble sitting nearby leaned in with an amused smile. "Captain Carter, you seem troubled. Is the food not to your liking?" Carter forced a smirk. "The food's fine," he said, stabbing a strange-looking piece of meat with his fork. "Just surprised by the whole no divorce thing." The noble chuckled, his elongated blue fingers tapping against the table. "Ah, humans, and their fleeting commitments. You truly didn't know. How amusing." Carter's jaw tightened. They were laughing at him. His gaze flicked to Serafina, but she didn't react to the noble's words. She only studied Carter with those intense golden eyes. Something about the way she looked at him made him uneasy. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't amusement. It was possession. A private conversation. An hour later, Carter had had enough. The moment he saw an opportunity, he stood abruptly. "I need some air." Serafina rose immediately. "I will accompany you." Carter hesitated. He wanted to refuse, but saying no to a princess in front of the entire court would cause problems. Instead, he nodded stiffly. "Fine." They walked through the palace's golden corridors, the high ceilings lined with glowing, star-like orbs. Guards in silver armor stood at every entrance, their expressions blank. Carter glanced around. Escape routes, weak spots, anything useful. Then he felt her gaze on him again. Serafina walked beside him, hands folded elegantly in front of her. "You are planning to leave." Carter let out a small laugh. "Is that a guess, or did you read my mind?" "I do not need to read your mind," she said smoothly. "Your body language is quite clear." Carter stopped walking. "All right, let's talk straight." He turned to face her. "I didn't sign up for this. I agreed to a political ceremony, not a lifetime bond." Serafina tilted her head slightly. "And yet, here you are." Carter exhaled sharply. "This isn't normal for humans. We don't do permanent soul bonding. We have options. Choice." Serafina stepped closer, invading his space. "And do you believe I had a choice?" Carter blinked. "What?" Serafina's expression remained unreadable, but her voice dropped slightly. "My father arranged this. He did not ask me if I wished for a human husband. He simply decreed it." Carter hadn't considered that. He had assumed Serafina was a willing participant in this mess. But now, was she just as trapped as he was? He frowned. "Then why are you going along with this? If you don't want this either, we can figure out a way to." "No." Serafina's voice was soft, but absolute. Carter narrowed his eyes. "Why not?" She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his wrist. The moment she touched him, something in his chest shifted. A warmth, a pull, something unseen, something real. Serafina's voice softened. "Because the bond is already formed, and I have no intention of letting go." Carter yanked his arm back. "Damn it. Serafina, I don't belong here. I have a life on Earth. A crew. Responsibilities." Serafina simply watched him. "Then you should not have said, 'I do.'" Carter gritted his teeth. "I didn't know it meant forever." Seraphina's golden eyes glowed slightly in the dim corridor. Now you do. The meaning of the bond. Carter turned away, rubbing his face. He needed answers. How does this bond even work? He asked finally. Is it some kind of magic? A law? What? Seraphina walked past him, placing a hand on a nearby crystal pillar. The surface rippled, and suddenly, images appeared in the air. Ancient Selvarian warriors standing before their partners, an ethereal golden thread connecting their hearts. This is the bond of the Selvarians, she explained. Once spoken, once sealed, it ties our souls together. If one of us dies, the other feels it. Carter felt a cold chill creep up his spine. Feels it. Seraphina's gaze met his. Yes. A beat of silence passed. Carter shook his head. So, if I leave, you will find it difficult, Seraphina said, repeating her father's earlier words. Carter took a slow breath. Define difficult. Seraphina stepped closer again. If you attempt to leave this world, you will feel a pulling pain in your chest, as if something is tearing apart. Because it is. Carter clenched his fists. That's insane. Seraphina's lips twitched slightly. Perhaps, but it is our way. Carter turned away. He needed time. He needed a plan. But most of all, he needed to break this bond. The duel for honor. The air inside the Selvarian palace was heavy, charged with silent tension. Carter sat in his chamber, staring at the smooth metallic walls. He had spent the last hour pacing, thinking, searching for a way out. Every time he thought he had a plan, Seraphina's words echoed in his head. If you attempt to leave this world, you will feel a pulling pain in your chest, as if something is tearing apart. Because it is. Carter clenched his jaw. This wasn't a marriage. This was a cage. The door to his chamber hissed open. A tall Selvarian guard entered, his armor gleaming under the dim blue lights. He bowed slightly. The Council of Nobles has summoned you. Carter frowned. For what? The guard didn't answer. Carter exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had no choice. Again. The gathering of nobles. The council chamber was a vast, circular room, its walls lined with glowing glyphs. Hundreds of Selvarian nobles sat in elevated seats, their sharp eyes locked onto Carter. The emperor sat at the highest point, his expression unreadable. Seraphina stood at the center of the chamber, her silver-blue skin gleaming under the ethereal lights. She looked calm, powerful, and yet, something in her eyes was different tonight. Carter barely had a moment to process the situation before a Selvarian warrior stepped forward. The warrior was massive, almost 7 feet tall, his muscles coiled like steel under his dark armor. His piercing red eyes locked onto Carter with pure disdain. I am Lord Xadris of the Eternal Flame, he said, voice like rolling thunder. And I challenge you, human. Carter blinked. Challenge me. The warrior smirked. Do you think you can take our princess and expect no opposition? A fragile earth-born creature, standing beside our future empress. You are an insult to our bloodline. Carter's stomach tightened. Great, just what I needed. Xadris continued, addressing the council. By our ancient traditions, an outsider who claims a royal must prove their worth in combat. His eyes flicked to Carter. Unless, of course, you prefer to flee like the weakling you are. The nobles chuckled. Some shook their heads, amused. Others whispered, waiting to see what the human would do. Carter exhaled. I don't suppose I can just say no, he muttered. Seraphina's voice was soft but firm. Declining the duel would mean forfeiting your position as my consort. Carter stiffened. Meaning? She tilted her head. Meaning you would be exiled from Selvaria, and your bond with me would cause you unbearable pain for the rest of your days. Carter cursed under his breath. This was a trap. A cruel, twisted game. Either he fought, or he suffered forever. Xadris grinned. So, human, will you fight? Or will you crawl back to your world, broken? Carter rolled his shoulders. "You talk too much," he muttered. "Let's get this over with." The council chamber erupted into cheers and murmurs. The duel was set. The duel begins. The dueling arena was unlike anything Carter had seen before. A massive circular platform, floating above a deep abyss. The air shimmered with energy fields, ensuring neither combatant could flee. Carter stood at the center, feeling the weight of the alien sword in his hands. It was heavier than the weapons he was used to, but he adjusted quickly. Cedrus entered the arena, gripping a bladed energy staff. His eyes gleamed with pure confidence. "I will enjoy this." Carter smirked. "You sure talk a lot for someone who hasn't won yet." The gong sounded. Cedrus moved fast, far faster than a man his size should be able to. His staff whirled through the air, coming down toward Carter with brutal force. Carter barely dodged, rolling to the side. His heart pounded. This guy was quicker than expected. Cedrus didn't let up. He struck again, this time sweeping low. Carter leaped over the attack, countering with a quick slash. Cedrus blocked effortlessly, his smirk widening. "You are slower than I thought," he taunted. Carter exhaled sharply. He needed a strategy. Fighting this guy head-on was suicide. Then he noticed it. Cedrus was aggressive, but his strikes left him open for brief moments. Carter dodged another blow and waited for the right moment. Cedrus lunged, too wide. Carter sidestepped, twisted, and slammed his hilt into Cedrus' ribs. The warrior grunted, staggering slightly. The crowd gasped. Carter grinned. "Not so invincible, huh?" Cedrus snarled. His stance changed. Now he was taking Carter seriously. The final strike. Cedrus moved in, his attacks more calculated now. Carter deflected each strike, using his human agility to stay ahead. Then Cedrus made a mistake. He overextended on a downward strike, leaving his chest wide open. Carter didn't hesitate. He stepped in and drove his fist into Cedrus' throat. The warrior choked, staggering backward. Carter spun, using all his momentum, and slammed the hilt of his sword into Cedrus' skull. Cracky! Cedrus collapsed to his knees. Blood trickled from his mouth. His weapon clattered to the ground. The arena fell silent. Carter stood over him, breathing hard. He could finish him. A single strike, and it would be over. But he didn't. He turned and tossed his weapon to the ground. "I'm done," he said. The nobles gasped. Seraphina's eyes widened. The emperor stood, watching Carter closely. Cedrus coughed and looked up with disbelief. "Why? Why don't you finish it?" Carter exhaled. "Because I don't need to kill you to prove my worth." Silence. Then, the emperor smiled. "The human has honor," he declared, "and he has won." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers. Seraphina stepped forward, looking at Carter with something new in her eyes. Admiration. Respect. Something deeper. Carter sighed. He had won the duel. But deep down, he knew. He was still trapped in this marriage, and now Seraphina might never let him go. Escape is not an option. Carter lay awake in his chamber, staring at the ceiling. The victory in the duel had secured his place at Seraphina's side, but it hadn't changed the one thing that mattered most. He was still trapped in this marriage. The walls of his chamber felt like they were closing in. The glow of Selverian lights, the rich scent of exotic flowers, the smooth silk of the sheets. It was all too much. He needed air. He needed to leave. His mind was set. Carter was getting off this planet tonight. A carefully planned escape. Carter moved silently, slipping through the corridors like a ghost. The palace was vast, but after days of observation, he had mapped out a possible escape route. The plan was simple. Avoid Seraphina's personal guards. They watched him too closely. Steal a transport ship from the royal hangar. Break through the planetary security grid. Get back to human space. If this soul bond thing was real, he'd deal with it later. Right now, he just needed to get away. As he turned a corner, he spotted two Xelvarian guards standing at an entrance to the lower halls. They were blocking his path. Carter reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small disruptor device he had swiped earlier from an engineering room. A quick pulse, and the energy field protecting the door would shut down for 10 seconds. It had to be enough. Taking a deep breath, he activated the disruptor. A soft hiss filled the air as the lights flickered. The guards turned, confused. That was his chance. Carter lunged forward, slamming his fist into the first guard's neck and grabbing the second in a quick chokehold. They were stronger, but Carter had training, special forces level training. In seconds, both guards were unconscious. Carter exhaled, shaking the tension from his hands. He stepped over their bodies and moved forward. He could see the hangar doors now. Almost there. Then, a soft voice cut through the silence. "Going somewhere, Jonathan." Carter froze. His blood turned to ice. Slowly, he turned around. Standing right behind him, draped in a flowing midnight blue gown, was Princess Serafina. Serafina's warning. She looked calm. Too calm. Her golden eyes locked onto him, unblinking. In her delicate hands, she held a small metallic ring that pulsed with energy. A tracking device. Carter clenched his fists. She had known. "How long have you been following me?" he asked, voice tight. Serafina took a step closer. "Long enough." Carter exhaled sharply. "I can't do this, Serafina. I can't stay here." Serafina tilted her head slightly, her silver blue skin shimmering in the soft light. "You believe you have a choice." Carter stiffened. "I do have a choice." Serafina's lips curled into something between a smirk and a sad smile. "No, you do not." Carter narrowed his eyes. "Why?" "Because of this bond. Because some ancient law says I belong to you." Serafina shook her head. "Because you cannot survive without me." Carter scoffed. "I've survived worse." Serafina sighed softly and raised her hand. "Then, let's see." A sharp pain exploded in Carter's chest. He stumbled, gripping his ribs, his breath hitching. It was like something inside him was being torn apart, like a vice tightening around his very soul. Serafina watched, her expression unreadable. "This is what happens when you try to leave," she whispered. Carter's knees buckled. The pain wasn't just physical. It was deeper, rawer, something unnatural. His vision blurred, his heartbeat stuttering. Serafina knelt beside him. "You are bonded to me, Carter," she said, her voice gentle now. "This is not a cage, as you call it. It is connection." Carter gasped for air, the pain finally fading. His body trembled, sweat dripping down his face. Serafina touched his forehead lightly. "You cannot escape me," she whispered. "Even if you leave this planet, you will feel it. The pain will only grow." Carter forced himself to sit up, glaring at her. "This isn't connection. This is control." Serafina's face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. "Hurt. Sadness." "Is it?" she murmured. A new reality. Carter was escorted back to his chamber, this time with double the guards. As he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands, the truth settled in. Escape was impossible. Even if he made it back to Earth, the pain would follow him, consume him, destroy him. He wasn't just physically trapped. He was bonded to her in a way he didn't understand. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. Serafina entered, moving gracefully. She stood before him, silent for a moment, then spoke softly. "I do not want you to suffer, Jonathan." Carter looked up, his eyes hard. "Then let me go." Serafina's expression didn't change, but she stepped closer, reaching out. Carter tensed, expecting another jolt of pain. Instead, her fingers brushed his cheek. "There is another way," she whispered. Carter frowned. "What?" Serafina hesitated, just for a second, before whispering, "If you accept the bond, the pain will stop." Carter's breath caught in his throat. Accept it, he repeated. Serafina nodded. If you open yourself to it, it will no longer be a burden. It will be a part of you. Carter clenched his fists. Was this her plan all along? Trap him so he had no choice but to submit. He shook his head. I won't be controlled. Serafina exhaled, sadness flickering in her golden eyes. I do not wish to control you, Carter, she murmured. I only wish for you to stay. With that, she turned and left. Carter sat there, his mind spinning. He had lost the fight for freedom. The real question now was, had he ever really wanted to leave? The Selverian betrayal. Carter had never been the kind of man to give up. He was a soldier, a survivor, and a man who had faced impossible odds before. But as he sat in his chambers, staring at his own reflection in the crystalline mirror, he knew one thing for certain. He was losing this fight. The bond was real. The pain, the pull, everything Serafina had warned him about wasn't some ancient superstition. It was tangible, unbreakable. Every time he thought about escape, his chest would tighten with an unbearable weight, like his very soul was being stretched to its breaking point. And the worst part, Serafina didn't seem cruel about it. She wasn't holding this over him as a punishment. She genuinely wanted him to stay. But why? Carter exhaled, shaking his head. It didn't matter. He needed to focus. There had to be another way. A loud knock on his door made him turn. Before he could answer, the doors slid open, and 2 armored Selverian guards stepped in. Their weapons were drawn, not raised, but not lowered either. Carter stiffened. This wasn't normal. Then, a tall figure stepped inside. Lord Xadris. Carter narrowed his eyes. Didn't I kick your ass already? Hadris smirked, but his red eyes gleamed with something darker this time. He wasn't here for another challenge. The Emperor summons you, Xadris said, his voice unreadable. It's urgent. Carter studied him for a long moment. Something felt off. But he had no choice. The ambush. The Imperial throne room was a sight Carter had seen only once before, the day of his wedding. It was massive, adorned with floating light orbs, swirling banners of gold and deep violet, and a ceiling so high it seemed to vanish into the stars. The Emperor sat on his throne, but something about his expression was different. He was tense, his golden robe rippling slightly, as if he were expecting something to happen. Serafina stood beside him, and the moment Carter entered, her eyes widened slightly. She knew something was wrong. Captain Carter, the Emperor said, his voice as deep as a distant storm. You have proven your strength before the Selverian people, but strength alone is not enough. Carter folded his arms. And what does that mean? A shadow moved behind him. Carter felt it before he saw it. Years of battle instincts kicked in, and he sidestepped just in time to avoid the blade aimed at his back. The attacker, a Selverian noble in dark robes, lunged again. Carter grabbed his wrist and twisted, flipping the assassin onto the polished floor. The sound of armor clashing filled the air as more figures emerged from the shadows. A full-scale assassination attempt. The room exploded into chaos. The fight for survival. Guards rushed forward, but it was unclear whose side they were on. Some protected the Emperor, but others turned their weapons on Serafina. Carter's instincts screamed. He lunged for her. One of the assassins raised a plasma dagger, striking at Serafina's side. Carter moved without thinking. He grabbed the attacker's wrist mid-strike and drove his elbow into his throat. The assassin choked, stumbling back. Carter ripped the dagger from his hands and turned, ready to take down the next. Serafina looked at him, her expression unreadable. But then, another assassin charge. Serafina spun, faster than Carter expected, and slammed her hand against the attacker's chest. A pulse of golden energy erupted, sending the assassin flying backward. Carter's eyes widened. What the hell was that? Serafina didn't stop. She moved through the chaos like a storm, dodging blades, striking with a speed and precision that wasn't normal. Carter had seen warriors before, but nothing like this. She was lethal. She was holding back before. And yet, despite the violence unfolding around her, her first words to him were not a battle cry. They were a single, desperate command. Stay close to me. The truth revealed. The fight lasted only minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The remaining assassins were either dead or captured, but the damage was done. The Emperor stood, his hands tightening into fists. Treachery, he spat. From within our own noble houses. Serafina turned to Carter, breathing heavily. Are you hurt? Carter shook his head. I'm fine. You? She nodded. Then her gaze darkened as she turned toward Xadris. Xadris. He had brought Carter here. He had lured him into this trap. You knew, Serafina said coldly. You knew, and you did nothing. Xadris smirked. Of course I knew. Carter's hands clenched into fists. Why? Xadris turned to him. Because you don't belong here, human. Because this empire is stronger without your presence. And because. He glanced at Serafina, his smirk widening. She's weaker because of you. Carter's blood boiled. You son of a... Serafina stepped forward, cutting him off. What will you do now? She asked Xadris, her voice dangerously calm. Xadris's smirk faded slightly. He glanced at the Emperor, at the guards who now surrounded him. He wasn't going to win this fight. But before he could speak, the Emperor's voice rang through the chamber. Xadris of the Eternal Flame, you are stripped of your title and cast from this empire. You have betrayed your own bloodline. Xadris's face twisted in rage, but he did not fight back. He turned and stormed away, disappearing into the shadows. The moment he was gone, the Emperor turned to Carter. You have defended the royal house, he said. You have saved my daughter. Carter exhaled. Great. Does that mean I get to leave now? The Emperor chuckled. No, it means you are now more important than ever. Carter groaned. Serafina was still watching him. And for the first time since their bond had been sealed, her expression held something more than duty. Something like trust. Something like understanding. Carter wasn't sure what it meant. But he knew one thing. His fight wasn't over. And deep down, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to be. The final decision. The Selverian night sky was unlike anything Carter had ever seen. Two massive moons hung in the sky, their silver glow casting eerie shadows across the towering crystal spires of the Imperial Palace. Carter stood on a balcony, gripping the railing. The air was thick with the scent of alien flora, a blend of something like jasmine and burning embers. Serafina's world was beautiful, but it wasn't his. And yet, why did it feel like leaving was getting harder? A conversation under the moons. You're thinking about it again. Carter didn't turn. He already knew who it was. Serafina stood beside him, her long white hair catching the moonlight. Her golden eyes studied him silently, as they always did, watching, analyzing, understanding. Carter exhaled. Thinking about what? Serafina tilted her head. Leaving. Carter smirked. Maybe. She let out a soft breath. Even after everything. Carter frowned. What do you mean? Serafina's gaze remained steady. You fought for me. You risked your life. You stayed when you could have let me die. Carter scoffed. Yeah, well, I don't like assassins. Serafina didn't smile. That's not the reason. Carter turned to her now, meeting her eyes. Then tell me, princess, what's the reason? She didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough that Carter could see the faint glow of the energy beneath her skin. That Selverian life force, pulsing like golden fire. Her voice was softer this time. You care. Carter blinked. Serafina's hand hovered near his wrist, hesitant. He had seen her tear through assassins, fight with a precision and lethality that had stunned him. But here now. She looked almost vulnerable. "You don't want to care," she continued, almost in a whisper. "But you do." Carter looked away. His chest felt tight. Serafina stepped back, sensing the shift in his emotions. "I will not stop you if you choose to go." Carter's fingers curled into a fist. "That's not what you said before." "I know," she admitted, "but things have changed." He turned back to her. "What changed?" Her golden eyes flickered. "You." The Emperor's decision. The next morning, Carter was summoned to the throne chamber once more. The Emperor sat on his massive throne, his sharp golden gaze locked onto Carter. The entire council of nobles was present, murmuring among themselves. Serafina stood at her father's side, silent. "Captain Jonathan Carter," the Emperor spoke, his voice echoing through the hall. "You have proven yourself in combat, in loyalty, and in spirit." Carter stiffened. That didn't sound good. The Emperor leaned forward, his sharp gaze cutting through the silence. "I offer you a choice." Carter raised a brow. "Oh, I like choices." A flicker of amusement crossed the Emperor's face. "1. You may leave," he said. "You may return to your people, and this empire will release you from your obligations." Carter's heart jumped. This was it, his way out. But the Emperor wasn't finished. 2. The Emperor continued, his voice steady. "You may stay. You will take your place beside my daughter, not as a mere consort, but as an equal. A ruler, a guardian of this empire." The hall fell into stunned silence. Carter's breath caught. "You're serious?" The Emperor's eyes glowed slightly. "Do I seem like a man who jokes?" Carter exhaled, glancing at Serafina. She wasn't looking at him. Her hands were folded in front of her, her face composed. But her fingers twitched slightly, a small tell. She was waiting. Waiting for his answer. The weight of a choice. Carter's thoughts raced. Leaving meant freedom. No more forced marriage. No more alien politics. No more soul bonds. He could return to Earth, to his ship, to his life. But if he left, he would always feel it. That pull. That hollow aching pain in his chest. Serafina had warned him. It wasn't just an emotional connection. It was real physical. He could walk away. But could he live with the cost? And if he stayed? Carter looked at Serafina again. She was still watching him, her expression unreadable. But her hands were trembling. Just barely. This wasn't a game to her. Not anymore. Carter took a slow breath. "I need a moment," he said. The Emperor nodded. "You have until nightfall." A final conversation. Carter sat in the gardens, staring up at the twin moons. Serafina approached, moving quietly. "You have until nightfall," she murmured. Carter exhaled. "Yeah, so I've heard." She hesitated, then sat beside him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then she finally spoke. "You can go, if you want to." Carter glanced at her. "Do you want me to go?" Serafina closed her eyes for a moment, then looked at him. "No," she admitted. "I don't." Carter swallowed hard. He hated how much those words affected him. "I never wanted this," he muttered. "I know." He turned to her. "Then why does it feel like I can't leave?" Serafina studied him for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She took his hand. Not forcefully, not like before. This time, it was gentle. A question, not a command. Carter didn't pull away. "Because," she whispered, "a bond is not just about what ties us together. It is about what we choose to make of it." He stared at her. And suddenly, Carter realized something. It wasn't just the bond keeping him here. It was her. The way she fought beside him. The way she looked at him. The way she trusted him when no one else did. Carter exhaled. "If I stay, things have to change." Serafina nodded. "Then change them." Carter stared at her for a long moment. Then finally, he made his choice. The unexpected choice. The moment Carter spoke his decision, the entire chamber fell silent. The Emperor's gaze remained steady, golden eyes locked onto Carter's. The nobles whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of shock, curiosity, and quiet disapproval. Serafina. She didn't move. She didn't even breathe. And then slowly, too slowly, she blinked. "You're staying?" she whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. Carter exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I guess I am." The room erupted into chaos. The aftermath of a decision. The nobles argued loudly, their voices clashing. Some were outraged, furious that a human had been elevated to such a position. Others remained silent, watching Carter with calculating expressions. The Emperor raised his hand, and the room fell into an uneasy hush. "You understand what this means, Captain Carter?" he asked. His tone was not threatening, but it carried weight. Carter squared his shoulders. "Yeah, it means I'm not going anywhere." A flicker of amusement crossed the Emperor's face. "No, it means you are no longer an outsider. If you stand beside my daughter, you stand as one of us. That comes with power, but it also comes with war." Carter frowned. "War?" The Emperor's expression turned grim. "You have made enemies today, Carter. Enemies within this court. Enemies outside this empire." The weight of his choice truly sank in. He wasn't just staying. He was claiming a place in a world that didn't want him. And that meant the fight was far from over. Serafina's reaction. The palace gardens were silent when Carter and Serafina finally found themselves alone. The moons above cast a soft glow on the crystalline trees, their leaves shimmering in shades of violet and blue. Serafina stood a few feet away from him, her back turned. She hadn't spoken since the chamber. Carter sighed. "So, are you going to say something, or are we just going to stand here all night?" Serafina turned slowly. Her golden eyes searched his face, as if trying to find a lie in his words. "Why did you stay?" she asked softly. Carter shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe I'm getting used to this place." Serafina narrowed her eyes. "You're lying." Carter smirked. "Maybe." Serafina took a step forward, then another, until she was so close that Carter could see the glowing veins of energy beneath her skin. "This bond, it is not a cage," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it is not something you can take lightly." Carter met her gaze. "I'm not." Serafina studied him for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and took his hand. Not as a command, not as a claim, but as a choice. A real, undeniable choice. Carter's chest tightened. He didn't pull away. For the first time since this insane journey began, he realized, maybe he didn't want to. The first challenge. The next morning, the reality of his decision hit him hard. The Emperor had called for a formal ceremony to announce Carter's position as Serafina's equal, and it seemed like the entire city had gathered to witness it. Thousands of Selvarians stood in the grand Coliseum-like hall, the air buzzing with tension. Carter stood beside Serafina, dressed in traditional Selvarian ceremonial armor, the dark silver material oddly comfortable. And then, as expected, the opposition arrived. From the highest seats of the noble houses, a tall, thin man in blood-red robes stepped forward. His skin was darker than the others, his golden eyes sharp and filled with quiet disdain. "I am Lord Valen of the High Dominion," he announced, his voice smooth and commanding. "And I challenge the right of this human to stand beside the throne." The audience murmured. Serafina stiffened beside Carter. The Emperor did not react. "By what claim do you challenge?" Valen smirked. "By the oldest claim of all, trial by honor." Carter sighed. "Of course." Serafina turned to him, concern flickering in her gaze. "Valen is a war tactician. He does not fight. He outsmarts." Carter raised a brow. "Well, that's different." Serafina's grip on his wrist tightened. "He will not fight you in the arena. He will test you in ways you do not expect. Carter exhaled. Let me guess. If I lose, you will not lose. Carter smirked. That confident in me, huh? Serafina's golden eyes glowed. No, I am confident in us. The trial begins. Valen smiled. Let the trial commence. The first test was strength, a test Carter could handle. He was given a Selvarian blade and forced to spar against 3 elite warriors at once. He fought hard. He fought smart. And he won. The second test was wit, a tactical game of strategy and deception. Valen smirked the entire time, laying traps within traps. But Carter was a soldier, a survivor. He had played this kind of game before. And he won. The final test was the test of will. Valen stepped forward. Tell me, human, if you were given the chance to leave this empire without pain, without consequence, would you take it? Silence. The audience held their breath. Serafina tensed. Carter looked at her. And then he smirked. No. Valen's smirk vanished. The Colosseum erupted into cheers. The Emperor stood. The trial is over. Valen's eyes darkened, but he said nothing. He simply bowed and disappeared into the crowd. Carter turned to Serafina. She was still looking at him, her eyes brighter than before. Without thinking, Carter reached for her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. And for the first time, Carter knew. He had truly chosen this. Epilogue. The new future. As the ceremony ended, Carter and Serafina stood on the grand balcony, overlooking the city. Carter exhaled. So, what now? Serafina smiled softly. Now, we build something new. Carter chuckled. That sounds like a lot of work. Serafina leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. Then it's a good thing you're not leaving. Carter laughed. For the first time since stepping foot on this world, he felt at home. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't trapped at all. Maybe he was exactly where he was supposed to be.